Well, welcome everyone to session 2 of the University of Cumbria Resilience Masterclass series. My name's Stephen Mullen and I'm one of your facilitators for today. So, how important is a security culture during a crisis? And what are some of these terms we've been hearing about business continuity and contingency planning? And how do these apply to me as an individual? Or if I'm a business owner, what do they mean for me and my business? Well, these are some of the issues that we'll be exploring in today's session. Now, to make these sessions more interactive, what we encourage you to do is send a question or a comment in advance to our panel, or if you're joining us live, you can actually use our live chat feature, which you'll find on this page below this video. So we do ask that you send us your comments and questions, and after the presentations, the panel will address those comments and questions. Now, due to the number of participants on these calls, we might not get around to answering everybody's comment and question in this live session, but we are creating a platform to allow communication among the community to continue, and so please do send us your comments and questions and we will be able to address them in some form. Finally, just to make you aware, the views and opinions of the presenters aren't necessarily the views and opinions of the University of Cumbria or any other organisation represented in this series. And also a copy of the presentation slides and any resources referred to will be made available to you after this event. Our first speaker for today is Ian Stainton. Ian is the designer and programme lead for the University of Cumbria's Security, Intelligence and Investigative Practice degree. Bringing over 30 years operational and training experience to his position as a senior lecturer, Ian leads programmes from the UK campuses and also to our international students using our distance learning programmes. A career in overt and covert investigative operations with numerous commendations to his name, Ian has designed and delivered intelligence, interviewing and communication data investigative practices both within the UK and overseas. And it's fair to say that Ian is gifted in enabling non-security practitioners to adopt a security philosophy and culture. And today, Ian will be sharing with us his perspective on key intelligence and security principles for business during a crisis. Ian, over to you.
Stephen, thank you very much for those kind words. My name is Ian Stainton and I am the programme lead for the Security, Intelligence and Investigative Practice course here at the University of Cumbria. I'm presenting today on intelligence and security principles for business during crisis, and will hopefully try and answer any of your questions and queries that will arise as a result of that, of the presentation, or indeed of your experiences. We are currently within a pandemic emergency. Pandemics have joined other emergencies in having huge security salience in the world. Sort of the recent merger of pandemics and security needs to be conceptualised. A lot of analysts to date have followed sort of broad tenets of what we refer to as a securitisation theory in identifying the emerging sort of health security nexus as a securitisation, leading to emergency measures and measures that we might not consider norms in non-emergency times. In the view, pandemics such as SARS, avian flu, COVID-19, going back to HIV and AIDS, are latest in a long line of wide social issues such as drugs, migration, the environment, terrorism, criminality and so on to become securitised, which means that they're framed of existential threats requiring the adoption of emergency measures. Now, the emergency measures aren't all legislation. The emergency measures will be taking place on a state level and will take place in relation to business, and in particularly business trying to create a sense of resilience and emerge from the current situation. The conventional wisdom on intelligence and crisis management tends to examine each subject in isolation of the other. I would suggest that the merging of these will create a more efficient regime. Now, intelligence gathering and analysis is without a doubt a specialism. Significant aspects rely on the input, conscious or unconscious of non-specialists. I don't propose to explore the specialist behaviours today, it's not the environment to do so. I'd like to provide a general overview of intelligence and security considerations in the current climate. I'd ask ourselves, can we forecast these black swan events, these rare, large-scale, large impact events that have an instant dynamic and an ongoing effect on us all? So what is the intelligence on intelligence? So what is intelligence? Intelligence is information plus analysis. The added value of intelligence over information consists of it being actionable knowledge. It's consumed by decision makers in many fields: national security, public health, business, commercial, retail, to help plan future activities in the short, mid or long term, what was often referred to as environmental scanning or horizon scanning. It influences many parts of our daily lives and ranges from what I would refer to as community intelligence to a whole variety of increasingly intrusive methods of gaining information to be analysed. Starts at the basic level that we all possess huge amounts of intelligence. So, for example, if I was considering moving to your local town and I got in contact with you, having your details after today, and said, excuse me, I'm thinking of moving to X town or X city, and I'm thinking of renting a house on this street. What do you think? You'd probably be able to give me a fairly instantaneous reaction as to whether that was someone that I would like to live or somewhere that perhaps I would like to reevaluate living on. And that is based upon your community intelligence. In order for us to enable to identify what's going wrong and to identify extreme behaviours, we've got to know what ordinary behaviours are. We've got to know what the norm is, and that varies from culture to culture, from society to society. So we have to look at those sort of things as well. So in general, intelligence aims at achieving a sort of depth of understanding of relevant factors. It's in the present that it enables us to create an accurate assessment of the probable future. So referring to the resilience theme of our conversations, the decision makers shouldn't underestimate the resilience of populations or indeed opponents to our plans. At its most extreme level, the resilience can be exampled in numerous global conflicts of the last 25-30 years. Every emergency is unique. We can, however, learn from history. Pandemics, attacks, war, famine, both historical and in the more recent past, can influence our planning and practice. Not learning from past experience is not a mark of human beings. 2009, the H1N1 pandemic was probably the first to occur in the current era of mass communication. Intelligence use in emergencies, for example, Hurricane Katrina, where it was possible to measure ward by ward, neighbourhood by neighbourhood and institution by institution focused progressions, justifications of particular kinds of relief efforts. These are all priorities in crisis mediation efforts, and they reflect the situation, context and contours. But they also show values and norms in action, both in crisis situations and in the more general day-to-day lives that we all value. They're sort of summed across many crises: values in actions, patterns, norms of resilience, a profile, community intelligence, showing what is preferentially protected during crisis, what we value during a crisis. This distilled view of what we want in the world also helps when doing routine change forecasting. So at its highest level, the system-specific profiling of normal and crisis resilience can achieve what we all want in the intelligence world, and that is the reduction of surprises. Certain myths surround intelligence. It's not secret. If it can't be shared, what use is it? Nobody knows what we're thinking. Whereas human beings, we are influenced, and we're not always rational. So modelling's based on expected behaviours. Are we acting rationally in times of crisis? How's this evolving as the situation develops, when our whole lifestyles, workplace and social interactions have changed? Are we reacting in the same way that we did 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 12 months ago? So we tend as society to model normality. We tend in businesses to create models that are based on normality. Then we're surprised in times of crisis. Some of the things that we need are looking at and other debates that are coming from the times in which we're living now. Contact tracing, the apps, it's recognised that this has the potential to address diseases and the transmission of diseases across society. But the freedoms and the values that we all cherish, is it acceptable under these tacit social condition terms that we are almost consenting to share this whole variety of information to deal with this emergency as well? So we're drawn towards the digital world in our considerations, often as a result of the internet. Now, a digital environment facilitates open, unrestricted communication across the majority of the globe. But don't think of it in isolation. Communication is a human trait with, as many things, the internet eases and contributes to its communication skills. And as with all communication behaviours, the ability to listen is just as, if not more important than the ability to speak or contribute. So we supply a huge amount of data for our digital interactions, illustrating our thoughts, desires, aspirations, acceptable and unacceptable behaviours, how we act in all sorts of crisis and normality situations. It showcases our ability to assess and cater for our particular audience at any one particular time. The digital world is a repository of data. You may have heard of big data or data mining, which is a process of extracting information relevant to a background activity. So the information that we would supply for retail options. What do we buy? What we're interested in? How much of a profile can we create from people's commercial activity in a particular retail environment? How do we pay? What are we interested in? What time of day do we shop? Etc., etc., etc. All particularly useful things in a business environment. All particularly useful things to study, because the resilience is based around us returning to our norms, and the norms may alter. There may be a situation of change as well. So we need to be looking at that as well. So the intelligence domain identifies correlations between data, which analyse and contribute to the formulation of actionable knowledge. What am I going to sell? How much am I going to sell? How much do I need to store? Etc., etc. Within security, the data is used to identify potential threats or adopt targeted preventative measures. So, having said that intelligence isn't secret, I'm going to use a quote from the Director General of the Security Service in the United Kingdom, which states that intelligence is gold. Andros, requiring validation, analysis and assessment, which we'll look at shortly. The gold shines and illuminates, saves lives, protects nations and informs policy. The dross needs to be rejected. Now that takes confidence, requires people of integrity not only to collect, but to prioritise, sift, judge and use it. The relevant point being to use it, because intelligence gathered for the sake of gathering intelligence, not being used, not being shared and not being actioned, is not a valuable use of anybody's time. So we've got to ask ourselves, what do you want? If I was going fishing, I'd have an aim to going fishing. I can't just generally go fishing. If I go fishing without an aim, it will result in accumulating masses of information, some of which will be useful, some of which will be not. The difficulty being that the useful will probably get lost within the not useful. So the ability to dispose of information, which is simply noise, is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve without knowing what my aim is. So we adapt for dynamic situations by acting. What do we know? So do we know what we know? Okay, what about the information we suspect exists, but which we currently don't know? So we know we don't know it. About the information gathered, which the intelligence officers don't know. the information that exists in other organisations, other institutions, or in people's minds or in people's psyches as well. And what about the information we didn't know existed? What about the information we may stumble across by accident? Well, how can we look at all those sort of things? Well, your way of looking at it within intelligence is to look through the intelligence cycle. Now, the whole variety of iterations of an intelligence cycle over the years, originally military models, been adapted to a whole variety of different use as well. I'm going to try and relate the parts of the model to a non-intelligence environment, which the majority of us operate. So if we look at the direction, okay, so we're not just gathering intelligence, we're looking for who, what, where, when, why, and how, all of which will be relevant to our own areas of operation. Again, what is known, what isn't known, how does it conflict, and is there a consistency in what we need to know? How can we suitably direct our information gathering? How can we collect it? So let's not be secret in the collection. We're not working for that type of organisation. Concepts might be the same, but the practice will be different. We've got access to a whole variety of data and information from people, from our own commercial records, and from the open source of the internet. Not forgetting the mass media. Mass media, including social media, is the source of the majority of information for the majority of the public. It's a tool for the early detection of social events. It's a powerful instrument for communicating. Now, if you refer back and we can learn lessons from the 2009 flu pandemic. That was a milestone for the diffusion and development of social communication networks. Despite the amount of institutional communication on the flu pandemic reaching a level never before experienced, I would suggest probably exceeded in the current situation, the vast mass of facts disappears when confronted by the flow of communication that occurred in the social media networks. The fact that social media cannot be governed or directed by central authorities opens up a whole variety of discussions as well. So we need to collate those as well. We need to look at the way social media represents the conversations. What are people buying, talking about and doing? If we want to identify different behaviours, we need to know what the norms are, locally, globally, society and culturally based. Business products perform this well each and every day. Collation is the gathering of that as well. So it isn't the time to dispose of things. The evaluation, what is the credibility of that information? Please consider as well that the vast majority of social network conversations represent an echo chamber, that people engage with an arena that mirrors or represents their own views, very rarely challenging them in the mass media. Okay, so we're looking at that. What's the provenance of the source? What's the influences on the source? Okay, as well as that, remember that in the worst case scenario as well, that the art of deception, Maskryvovka, valued military practice as well. So we've got to be aware of that potential for deception, certainly in the business world as well. The analysis of it, beware noise. And consider the non-barking dogs. The Sherlock Holmes thing. Are you expecting something to happen that isn't happening? So in the moral of the non-barking dog, there was a horse was stolen, and the analysis of that showed that the stable dog did not bark that night. Now, what will that tell us? Well, for a dog not to bark, it probably involved somebody being involved who the dog was familiar with. So the concept of the non-barking dog, what isn't there that you would expect to be there as well? And the dissemination of it. This is your communication channel. It's a cyclical process, and it leads into the collection, collation, evaluation, etc., etc. Again, the content and quality of information provided is the great influencer. So beware of the fear and confusion that one can cause in relation to that. The securitization and issue, the sort of security issues, I'd liken them to change as well. The 2003 SARS episode represents a wider warning about what can happen in the event of a flu pandemic ravaging the human population. It showed that health-focused dimensions of security warrant greater attention. Now, resilience often involves change. Much have been written about change in management business courses, and I do not wish to recreate these debates here, just to acknowledge the influence change has on humans. Many of us who are adverse to change, particularly after periods of enforced alteration and change, monitor the social networks today. You'll see people's desire to return to the immediate past. So within the abilities to do so, the logics for doing so, some features and elements of what was before will be operationally and professionally retained or altered during a change process. So which parts are we going to take with us, which not? So prosaically, during normal change, what's retained and altered? Why? How? And during a crisis, are you going to save the children? Or are you going to save your car? After a crisis, how and why does it return to normality? Or is it a version of normality in its own particular way? We need to be concerned about a geography of blame. Now that was observed, sort of a metamorphosis of the folk devil phenomenon to the internet during the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s, when mass communication wasn't as open as today. This appears to be mirrored during the early stages of the current crisis as well, that we have this geography of blame, and we all have the ability to minimise this and prevent this developing into periods of hate and dispute during the next days, weeks and months. So securitisation refers to a situation being couched in security terms, thus easing influence on the behaviours. Refer back to when we were talking about the tracing apps previously. So according to securitisation theory, security can be defined as a sort of self-referential practice, because it's in this practice that the issue becomes a security issue. Once infectious diseases are securitised, they become a security emergency, which legitimises extraordinary measures of global governance. Springing back under real-world challenge pressures is hardly ever about returning to the status quo. There will be elements of change. And the emergence of a post-Westphalian system of health governance has repercussions for our intelligence and security considerations. The previous SARS episode represents a break with the 19th and 20th centuries, during which the notion of state sovereignty was paramount, and internal sovereignty remained closely guarded. The post-Westphalian era of public health, inaugurated by SARS in contrast, is marked by a much stronger emphasis and role for international organisations. This mirrors across to the business and commercial world as well. Now, market forces are influencing this global approach. There's freely sharing of information, only to be later charged high prices for products developed on the basis of the information. So the old Westphalian notion of sovereignty is rearing its head once again, testifying to the persistent difficulties in securing cooperation across borders, including the field of international security and intelligence exchange. This is as relevant to business as it is to state security measures. Writing in the New York Times in 2005, Barack Obama argued that when we think of major threats to our national security, the first to come to mind are nuclear proliferation, rogue states and global terrorism. But another kind of threat lurks beyond our shores, one from nature, not humans, a flu pandemic. An outbreak could cause millions of deaths, destabilise Southeast Asia and threaten the security of governments around the world. Obama went on to comment again in 2010 in relation to a terrorist plot that it was not a failure to collect intelligence that contributed to that. It was a failure to integrate and understand the intelligence that we already had. A point I would like to make in the commercial environment and the business environment as well. It's the integration and the intelligence that we already have, so we don't look at things in a compartmentalised version. I'll leave you with the point that the 2015 United Kingdom National Risk Register identified pandemics and emerging infectious diseases as the highest other risk in the United Kingdom. Coming back to the point that intelligence acquisition for its own purpose, without associated action, is invalid and not the best use of time for the majority of the organisations. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ian. Our second presenter today is Alex Leake. Alex joined the University of Cumbria in January 2016, having enjoyed a career that encompassed the private sector, criminal justice sector, local government, and more recently in an international setting at a postgraduate University of Science and Technology in the Middle East. Alex is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and his academic interest lays in business continuity and resilience, multi-agency working, policing, criminology, and the criminal and justice penal systems. He lives in the south of Cumbria with his family, and today Alex will be sharing with us his perspective on how many of us are probably already living out the principles of resilience, but perhaps without realizing it. Alex, over to you.
Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Today, I want to talk to you about natural resilience and the timeliness of this, the masterclass and this conversation. I think it's so important at this present time. We face so many challenges at this moment in time, both within our communities, but also nationally. So I want to talk to you from a particularly philosophical perspective about what I would term natural resilience. So the question I would put is, what happens when the metaphorical roof falls in? So what do I mean by that? So this is that moment in time when things happen that you've not planned for, not thought of, and you've not considered in terms of how you move forward. And what do we understand by the term resilience? And why is it that we so often use this term after an event rather than being prepared to encounter such events in the future? And I'd like to take a journey through this from a philosophical perspective, because I think it adds a new nuance to the conversation around resilience that we need to have a think about. So one of the things that I'd like to do to start with is to ask you to just pause for a moment and reflect and understand and recognize the resilience that's already around us, that we live with day to day, that we take for granted, and we don't really think about, because it's part of our natural makeup, it's part of our society, it's part of how we live our lives. And the first thing that I would ask you to do is to consider this particular point, that we need to celebrate that we're here at all. So what do I mean by this? Well, we've survived famine, we've survived war, we've survived pestilence, we've survived some more war, and we've survived invasion. Now, these all sound rather grand and imperiling, but in reality, historically, these are things that we as a species have been through time and time again, and we've survived. So this is not to be taken lightly. So what I'd like you to consider is that we have this fascination with all things historical, and in particular all things historical in relation to what happened with royal dynasties and how these have progressed over time. And when you think about, for instance, British history, and you look at some of the most long-lived dynasties that have existed in our time, and in particular dynasties such as the Plantagenets, the Tudors, we think of them often in terms of from a historical perspective. But what I'd like you to consider is this aspect of what about us? What about the vantage point that we have historically from our ancestors? So the point I'm making is that to consider this celebrate that we are here at all is actually as bystanders in these historical aspects, we've managed to survive through our ancestors to get to the point we are at this present time. So to understand that in the context of what I'm trying to explain is we have this innate resilience historically. So some of us are not from, in fact, most of us are not from any sort of particular pedigree in terms of royal pedigree or anything like that. But what we are and what we have is a presence in this world right now as a result of our ancestors. So that to me suggests that we have some sort of biological resilience, cultural resilience, and philosophical resilience that has brought us to where we are. We've survived. Our settled communities, and in particular farming, you could argue, has ultimately led to our empires, and empires that have grown out of nothing. And it could be argued that had we stayed as hunter-gatherers, things may have been very different. When anthropologists look at different communities, those who organised themselves around farming communities, around homesteads, and developed particular methods of farming, meant that they were particularly tied to the land. And those who maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle were less so. So they were less incumbent upon that. But because of that change, what happened was that we then had to develop social order, to develop an organisational code around all of that, codes of living, social contracts. And it caused us to consider, indirectly, the need to build resilience. So this need to build resilience also means that we needed to learn to cooperate and to understand the needs of others. So when I talk about having this innate resilience and a natural resilience, what I'm talking about really is our ability to survive and to move forward. So when we go past that moment of cataclysm, when we go past that moment of disaster, when our first immediate thought is to wonder what to do and what next, actually we fall back upon instincts that we've had within us for quite some time. So surviving beyond the cataclysm, what are we talking about? Well, as I suggest, we all have this inherited personal resilience. Some of us are able to engage this more immediately than others. Some of this is born out of experience, some of it is born out of education, and some of it is born out of a sheer need to survive. Personal resilience exists within us and enables us to move from one situation to the next with a view of surviving with a positive outlook. When we look at professional resilience, this is another thing altogether. So this is about trying to think about how we ensure that our colleagues are able to move forward safely and to be able to work and to establish some sort of normality within the workplace, or as in this present time, in the home, which has become the workplace. And what has been really interesting over recent time is how quickly we have all been able to adapt to being able to either work from home or to look to adapt ourselves to occupation in other ways. I'm conscious of the fact that many people have had to step away from their employment at this present time to look to think about how they then manage going forward and to reinvent themselves. And whilst their organisations may sit there in the background waiting to be re-employed again, I think we in higher education have been rather fortunate in this regard that we still have our day jobs. When we think about organisational resilience, we're thinking about something that is part of our ability to make sure that our organisations are staying focused around what our core operational responsibilities relate to. But also in doing that, it's also about making sure that we're tied into those other parts of our communities and our networks that need to function at this time. And again, I would suggest that it's part of that innate responsibility we have in ourselves to think about how we support and look after each other. That we also think about that in relation to how our organisations, the companies, the businesses, the public services that in which we operate, that need to continue to function. Community resilience, again, is something that's been really interesting over this recent period of time. We've seen it before when we've had climate change issues related to storms and other issues connected into climate change, where communities come together and they begin to respond in a way that looks to support each other. The comforting thing with all the challenges that we face in the world at this present time and nationally is that when it comes to a moment of community need, most people, if not all people, tend to step forward and say and ask, what is it that I can do to help you? And organisations are part of those communities. And it's really important that those organisations are asking those same questions. And I think on the whole, most organisations have been able to do that and to look to do that, recognising that personal resilience, professional resilience sits within all of that. That whilst we separate ourselves out into the different parts of ourselves, ultimately we exist within the community. This then factors into national and international resilience in terms of how we move forward. Already the conversations are starting to take place, both nationally and internationally, about how we respond to this current crisis and how we move forward. This is important because it takes us then onto the next stage in terms of how we need to think about coming out of this at the other end with the semblance of normality and the semblance of having a future to look forward to. This is a challenge. This is a challenge on a number of levels because it has us to consider where the opportunities to grow will be, but also where we need to change our current practices. Some of the things that I reflect on and think about in terms of where I hope we can take some learning is how we can remove ourselves from our perceived understanding around teaching and learning and how we've been traditionally tied into classrooms, and how this current situation has presented as an opportunity to move away from that, think about how we can still teach and deliver quality programs, but in a different way. Similarly, it asks us to think about what other opportunities we can take from this in relation to environmental responsibility and climate change. So I think, again, this is something that we need to think about. So in recognizing vulnerabilities, I think we have a number of things that we have to consider. At the top of this, I think it is the people that surround us, both in our personal lives and our professional life, but in our communities as well. When we recognize vulnerabilities, we need to think and place the people at the top of this particular pyramid so that we consider what their needs are and how we respond to people. One of the most telling moments for me in each and every week that we've been existing in lockdown is the Thursday night episode where we all go out and mark the contribution and sacrifice that those who are key workers have contributed to our communities over this recent time. Other vulnerabilities to consider are, in a resilient sense, in a very practical sense, are things like sites and facilities, because we need these places from which to base ourselves and to operate. Now, these sites and facilities are slowly evolving, as I suggested previously, that the home has become a workplace. And whilst I think many of us would welcome the opportunity to be able to work from home from time to time, also that divide from personal life and work life has been difficult at this present time. Supply chains and networks, these again have been challenged over recent time, but again, it's been remarkable to see how organizations and companies and businesses and public sector organizations have been able to respond to the demands around the challenges of supply chains and networks, and how they've evolved their practices to make sure that people can operate in their day-to-day work and in a way that is safe and follows the guidance that's been offered by the scientists and by governments nationally and internationally. Part of that, though, has to be about how we communicate, and communications and IT, I think, have pushed many of us to embrace IT solutions to some of the challenges that we've faced over recent times. So I think in relation to how we're learning to adapt and the necessity of the situation we face at the present time, I've enabled us all to start thinking differently about how we approach this. In this too, and it connects into obviously people's sites, supply chains, communications, are our key stakeholders and customers. How we relate to people who matter to us in terms of our business, whether they're students, whether they're organizations we are contracted to or we work with, or who we are helping to develop businesses with. This is really important because we need to stay connected and we need to listen to what their concerns are, so that we can respond to them in a way that is timely and efficient, so that we can start to think about how do we get back to that business as usual status. Key to that also is finance and making sure that the oils that run these organizations, the financial oils that run these organizations, are present and able to function properly. And at the bottom of this list, I've put reputation. But reputation, I think, is incumbent upon the points that exist above. I think if you get those right, the people, the sites, the supply chains, the communication, stakeholders and customers, and the other parts around finance, then if you manage those correctly, then reputation follows on naturally from that. So these do not exist in isolation, and they're interchangeable and dependent. And you don't take them so much as a list, but more as an interactive and self-reliant the points that people need to consider when moving forward from a point of crisis to a point of operational sustainability. So be prepared. Learn through experience and not getting it right. One of the things that I would really hope in terms of resilience we get out of our experiences over recent years and from the recent current situation is the value of adopting a proactive rather than the reactive set of scenarios to take us forward. What I mean by that is that too often when we're faced with situations that challenge us organisationally, professionally, personally, and as communities, is that we too often act after the fact. I think we've all been through enough over recent years in terms of issues connected to climate change and, of course, this most recent pandemic, to understand that we need to start thinking about what the future holds. And this isn't just what the future holds in terms of for us personally and organisationally, but also in terms of how we respond to that. And so I would suggest there's a value in developing simulation scenarios to test some of that, test our resilience in certain instances, testing resilience until it breaks. And we can do that using tabletop exercises, by running scenarios, by developing exercises to look at how we operate and how we function as communities, but also as organisations and as groups of professionals. This is really important because it helps test our capacity to survive. It helps test our capacity to maintain our businesses and our workplaces as they need to be at times of crisis. Too often, though, it's often a top shelf exercise in the sense that we write the documents, we produce the documents, we talk to people about it, but then it gets filed and put on the top shelf. And it needs to live. It needs to be something that becomes part of our DNA organisationally, so that we understand the value of resilience in organisations. And this resilience doesn't just apply to when we have catastrophic events or events that are life limiting or whatever. They apply to our general business and mean that we are more adept at being able to evolve organisationally, but also move forward as learning organisations collectively. So this is very much about being able to adapt and to evolve, to looking at new opportunities, but also coming through situations like this with an outlook that is positive and creative, and that we support each other through all of this. So failing to learn. This is critical because if we do nothing with the learning that we've achieved so far and we return to a status of thinking it won't happen again, then we're setting ourselves up to fail yet again. And it's really important that we adopt this different and changing mindset about resilience. So I think it's really important that we step back from this and we think about our natural resilience and we think about how it is we managed to get here. And that from that historical perspective that I tried to I played for you earlier in relation to how we've come through the generations to get to where we are. And what I would say is we shouldn't just be sage after the event. We need to look forward. We need to be proactive in terms of how we plan for the future and the possible events that we face. And I think it's about being around long enough to share our experiences with our descendants. So I talked about ancestors, but I'd also like to talk about descendants. Because our descendants are important, because if we look forward to what is to come and we take care of what is to come, then our descendants will have a far rosier future. Thank you.